Content warning. This episode discusses the topic of self-harm and suicide. If you or someone you know is affected by suicide, struggling, or in crisis, help is available. Call or text the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline on 988 or visit 988lifeline.org. 45645 in Canada and 0800-689-5652 in the UK are the numbers that you want to dial. Take action for yourself and be there for others. Enjoy the episode. The Sandman Unlocked.
I am the anti-life, the beast of judgment. I am the dark at the end of everything, the end of universes, gods, worlds, of everything.
Hello, dreamers, and welcome to another episode of The Sandman Unlocked. I'm one of your co-hosts, Ashley Mowers, and I am thrilled you're joining us for our breakdown of The Sandman Episode 4, A Hope in Hell. I'm joined by two shining beams of light, my resplendent co-hosts, Sean.
What's up, everybody?
And Ben.
Hey, y'all.
On each episode, we'll be deconstructing the issue in 6 separate sections. First will be the rundown, where we let you know who created the issue, and then the catch-up to be sure you know where we are in the story. Next, we'll do the breakdown, which will give you a synopsis of that week's issue, and we follow that up with the deep dive, when we really get into everything that happened. In our last 2 sections, we'll discuss our favorite panel and our favorite non-Morpheus character.
So there you have it. 6 sections to get through, so let's get going. Ben, over to you for the rundown.
This is issue 4, A Hope in Hell, which was originally published on March 2nd, 1989. It was written by Neil Gaiman, penciled by Sam Keith. The inker was Mike Dringenberg. Colorist was Robbie Bush. Letterer, Todd Klein. It had art editing by Art Young, and the overall editor was Karen Berger. Sean, what's the catch-up?
Sweet Morpheus, the king of dreams, was caught by mortals like a newly fledged demon. During his 70-odd-year imprisonment, the powerful tools he uses to rule his kingdom, a pouch of sand, a helmet, and a ruby, were stolen from him and are now scattered across the waking world. After escaping his imprisonment and returning to the dream realm, Morpheus begins tracking down his tools, starting with a pouch of sand. With the help of the mystic John Constantine, Morpheus recovers his pouch of sand, which had been eating people and turning them into wallpaper in a London suburb. Emboldened by the power he recovered in his sand, Dream makes ready to seek out his next implement, the helm he carved from a dead god's bones, which had found its way into the hands of a demon. As we begin this issue, Dream makes ready to go to hell and recover what's his. Ashley, do you want to take us through the breakdown?
All right. In this issue, we start with Dream touching sand for the first time since he's retrieved it, and he heads to the nightward shores of Dream to travel to hell and reclaim his helm. He expresses feeling both lonely and rather cynical about his chances of success before he departs. He arrives to the Gate of Damnation, punches the gong, and Squatterbloat the Demon, to announce his arrival, and travels further into the realm guided by Etrigan the Half-Man. After passing the Wood of Suicides and running into his ex-lover Nada after 10,000 years, he finally walks into the Hell City of Dis. There he's greeted by none other than the Lightbringer himself, Lucifer Morningstar. Despite still being greeted as envoy, he finds hell much changed. Lucifer is no longer sole monarch and instead rules as one part of an unholy triumvirate with Beelzebub and Azazel. The 3 kings summon all the demons to the plains of hell, and despite the hordes, Dream locates the demon in question with a bit of dream sand. Dream submits a formal challenge to this demon, Karanzan. Being so challenged, Karanzan chooses reality as the battlefield, and they are transported to the Hellfire Club, a dingy-looking nightclub where both contenders play the oldest game, all while wearing zoot suits. This battle of nerve and imagination ends in an arresting final display by Dream himself, rendering the demons silent and he the winner. Despite this victory, Lucifer issues a threat, suggesting he doesn't have the power to leave the realm. Again, Dream humbly submits to the rhetorical gambit with his own innocent question. What power would hell have if those imprisoned were unable to dream of heaven? The crowd parts for his silent exit, his hopes fulfilled, and Lucifer's ambitions once again overcome, unsatisfied. In an epilogue, we find ourselves in Arkham Asylum, where a guard delivers news to John Dee that his mother has died, and tosses him his only inheritance, a demonic protective amulet. Dr. Destiny thanks his mother, claiming it is just what he's always wanted.
Thanks for that, Ashley. And seeing as how great of a time that Dream had in that club, I think we should go check it out ourselves. What do you say?
Is there a cover?
All right, so we're finally at an issue with a ton of propulsiveness, all by Dream, doing a lot of things, finding a new antagonist potentially here in Lucifer Morningstar. And so I do think it makes sense to really set the stage as much as possible and really start with who is this Satan, Lucifer, Morningstar as a biblical character, who he is in this comic book. And we just happen to have a theologian here on the podcast, so it makes sense to pitch it over to Ashley and let her go on a bit of a rant here. So Ashley, let's have it.
Yes,
Who is Satan?
I've been preparing my whole life for this question. So odd that I wind up here. So yeah, there is a lot to discuss with regard to the character of Lucifer, both in this comic and throughout biblical eschatology. So I'm trying to decide where to start. I think I'm going to start from the very beginning and go with the Old Testament and then move from there, because there are a lot of presuppositions people take to and ascribe to the character, mainly just out of, born out of artistic imagination. There are a lot of shortcuts we take to try to create an ultimate evil in a lot of literature. So I guess I want to first ask you, when you think of Satan, the devil, Lucifer, where's the first place you imagine him showing up in Scripture?
I guess I think of like Garden of Eden, like the tempting serpent.
Okay, so that's exactly what most people would say, and that's a common answer. And I'm grateful that you've said that, because that is, again, what a general perception of the first introduction to Satan, to the devil, is. The serpent in Genesis, you'll be shocked to find out, is not necessarily Satan as we think of him. Because the concept of Satan hadn't been invented yet when Genesis was written. The snake in Genesis really is just meant to be a snake, period. There are a lot of different antagonists throughout the Old Testament, throughout Hebrew scripture, that come up that represent what is ultimately the big bad in the Old Testament, which is chaos. So you've got the serpent, who you can interpret as having been under some sort of bad influence, acting as a bad influence, and we can get into that with regard to how seraphim are translated within Isaiah, and that concept of the Hebrew seraph, which means fire, and snake, specifically in Isaiah. So you've got that context. You've got Leviathan, which is a giant water serpent that represents chaos, is a mythical sea monster, as a personification of chaos, gets in the way of disorder. It gets in the way of ordering creation, as Yahweh is described as trying to create order from chaos.
I knew Leviathan primarily through Final Fantasy games. As an Esper you can summon.
Yes, exactly. So, like, very common imagery to have evil or chaos specifically be interpreted as a water snake or as a sea snake. You would see that in a lot of ancient creation myths. So they're adopting from that to help set the stage for humanity's relationship with God, God's relationship to creation, and ultimately trying to order the chaos itself. You don't get to Lucifer until you get to Isaiah 14, verse 12, which is relating to the Hebrew phrase Hallel ben Shachar. Hallel being an honorific noun, meaning shining one, and then ben Shachar meaning son of dawn. The reason we get the word Lucifer is because the Vulgate, which is a Latin translation of the Bible, translated Hallel ben Shachar to Lucifer, which means light bearer. So that's where you see that in the comic, light bringer, light bearer, that kind of imagery. Tradition had then equated Lucifer with Satan, but the author of Isaiah most likely wasn't thinking of the chief of demons in mind so much as he was specifically thinking in that context of the king of Babylon, Babylon being a political big bad in that context. So using that imagery to describe a different antagonist, but ultimately describing evil. Satan is really a word for one who accuses. So when you say Satan, it's actually the Satan. It's not a proper noun. So when you get the Satan, you get the accuser, the one who accuses, the adversary. So that can get confusing for people because you just shorten it to Satan and then it becomes a name, and it's not a name. It's just a general noun for accuser. And it occurs 9 times in the Hebrew Bible, 5 times to describe human military, a political or legal opponent, and then 4 times with reference to a divine being specifically. So it's always the Satan. So when if you just casually happen to read your Bible, if you come across the word Satan, add the in there and say the Satan.
With like a little carrot. Like a little carrot. The
Exactly. If you could just start sort of editing your own Bible to add these notes as we go along,
just some marginalia, just some brief, just some brief marginalia,
Right, exactly. For your own sort of comic book devotional process, that would be really helpful, probably, for your interpretation.
Do that in your Bible, not your comic books, please. That doesn't belong there.
No marginalia in the comic book, Sean.
No.
Okay.
Well,
are Post-it notes okay?
I got to draw the line.
Like a little Post-it note?
I don't know if how good the glue is for
cool.
paper.
I'm never adjusting my camera so Sean can see my copy. This has scared me. The concept most likely is coming from the judicial life of Israel. So there are lots of acts of interest for justice, therefore the interests of God. And so you see this the most in the book of Job, where you have the function of the Satan being demonstrated in this grand dramatic narrative where the Satan is raising questions about righteousness and who is righteous and who can stand before God. So Satan is functioning as a role of prosecution for God and, assessing the saints. So when the Satan suggests that Job's righteousness is superficial, he's kicking off that inciting incident, and then we get that whole story of Job going through several trials and tribulations, and then ultimately getting to the point where he questions God's goodness, and then God comes back and says, I was there from the very beginning. I've had you from the very beginning. Who are you to question me, ultimately? And then reinstates all of his wealth, his family, tenfold. So the Satan, again, functions as that prosecutor role to really be kind of a refining fire in some ways and point out where someone who claims righteousness might actually be pretty flimsy in having claimed such. You also see this in Zechariah 3, verses 1 through 2, where Yahweh then rebukes Satan, who is ready to accuse the high priest Joshua, shifting the role as a servant of God to an accuser of the saints. So you go from Job, where he's serving God in a sort of clarifying way, and then towards the end, he takes on a slightly sinister tone. And then in Zechariah, he's completely just going after people. And that's where you see the enmity between the Satan and humanity develop. And that's carried out then through the New Testament, which people might be a little more familiar with, where Satan regains or retains that Old Testament function, continues to have access to God. You see that frequently in Christ's remarks on Satan having, quote unquote, fallen from heaven, suggesting he is no longer serving in the court of God. You see this in Revelation, you see this in Luke, John, etc. And it's interesting because that's where you start to see more of a dualistic or diametrically opposed nature between Satan and Christ, because where Satan would act as prosecutor, Christ, for lack of a better word, would be defense attorney in some regard. So you see that redemptive work coming through in Christ. If we're going to follow that courtroom analogy set up in the Old Testament, then Christ sort of wipes away the debt. He's at odds with Satan's role. And then it's a reductive sort of dualistic battle sense. I'm sure we've all seen those really awful faux paintings in Christian bookshops where you've got the devil and Jesus boxing, or you see them like over a war, like a battlefield, and they're like clouds and it's ominous and kind of metal, but really ultimately very awful.
That's not canonical? I thought...
You know what? Shockingly, not so much.
I've read the Bible. It's been a while. I just had always assumed, like, this must be true. Like...
Yeah, totally. This is scripture. You'd be so sad to hear how many times I've had to point out, no, that's not it. Like, they're not playing chess in the sky. Just please. But that's where you get a lot of that imagery. It then deepens our understanding of Christ's temptation in the desert, because then you have Satan fulfilling his Old Testament role of reviewing the righteousness of one person and sort of questioning and trying to tempt and get people to falter, to really assess, are they righteous, are they not? So you've got this character who's kind of been heightened throughout medieval art and imagination and scholarship. Really, ultimately, that's been a way to grapple with the difficulty and problem of evil in the world. You see it much more clearly in the Old Testament, and you see it within not only ancient Israelite culture, but also in Jewish faith. Like just the idea of evil and pain being much better understood than frankly in Christianity a lot of ways, because especially in modern Christianity, there is this discomfort with pain and with suffering. And so what do? We blame that on the devil. Let's get it out of the way. Let's blame everything on that, when really it's just a helpful way to understand the concept of, why people may choose to do really evil things, and the fact that evil exists in the world. It's one way of sort of anthropomorphizing and containing that evil so we can understand better our role within the world.
So then we kind of have this anthropomorphizing of this idea, and then in the comic we have that represented here by this fallen angel Lucifer, who is now in a three-way ruling of hell. And Sean, I thought we could slide over to you to kind of expand on what is kind of going on here from what we can tell so far. In hell, we have legions of demons. We have three rulers. Just give us a snapshot of what is Dream walking into when he originally expected something much different. He expected a single monarchy ruled over by Lucifer, and he is walking into a different situation.
Yeah, good question, because we are in a very particular hell here. And if you just knew the pop cultural kind of sense of what, or religious sense of what hell might look like, you might be like, hey, why is it ruled by a triumvirate? Who's this little yellow demon guy, and why does it matter if he's rhyming or not? So hopefully I can help out with that. Now, the short answer to the question of what's happening in hell in this comic is that preceding this book, in Alan Moore's Swamp Thing series, which we know is a big influence on Neil Gaiman's work in Sandman, there was this massive storyline where this entity called the Great Darkness is going to erase existence, basically, and all of this sort of mystical beings, many demons and devils included, in the DC universe kind of team up to take him on. But this results in a kind of chaos created in hell. Maybe a little ironic there based on what Ashley was saying. But Lucifer is then forced into this sort of power-sharing arrangement with two other devils to maintain stability. The thing to keep in mind here is that even though Neil Gaiman and Sam Keith and Mike Dringenberg are telling their own story, and it's a colossal narrative that shaped this fictional world for decades, at the time, these 20-something kids are very much playing in someone else's sandbox, right? This can't be entirely the hell of Neil Gaiman's imagination, and it can't be entirely the hell of religious doctrine. At this time, it has to be the same hell that exists in the world of Superman and Batman and The Flash and Swamp Thing.
This is why it's important to remember that the Sandman is situated inside of the DC universe, even though it's on the Dark Horse comic publishing arm. Is that right?
Vertigo.
Oh, Vertigo.
But Vertigo didn't exist at this time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that. Okay.
Dark Horse is a separate publishing company.
We'll just cut all this then.
Well, I did like that comment, though. Can you just keep going with most of that?
Sure. Keep it.
No, I mean I liked the setup there because it is important to keep in mind that the Sandman at this time takes place within this fictional DC comic book universe, and at the time for DC, this is hugely important, maintaining the sense of what we call continuity, right? Here's why. So in the early days of American comic books, in the 30s and 40s, the people who were producing these books, they're barely older than kids themselves. They're working in these cramped, sweaty offices. They're banging away on typewriters as quickly as possible to make the most of their page rates. And what they're making is thought of as quick, cheap, disposable entertainment. So they're not thinking about any sort of internal consistency in the story they're telling, and they certainly aren't thinking about being consistent with the stories other people are telling. With each new story, the whole world would reset as though the previous story had never happened, and the characters could continue to encounter these novel adventures without these events ever being inscribed in their past or weighing on their future. There's a great essay on this sort of dreamlike reality of early superhero books by Umberto Eco called The Myth of Superman. So if you can track it down, it's worth reading.
A link to it will be in the show notes.
Yeah, but that all started to change when the next generation of comics creators come of age. Because for these people, these stories they read as kids mattered, right? They weren't forgettable. They happened to these characters, and they were a part of who they were. So if, Batman and Superman teamed up to fight the Joker, they will have always teamed up to fight the Joker, and it could be referenced in any future meetings they have. So this is the idea of universal continuity, which I'm quoting an article here, you could describe as the meta-narrative created out of the sum total of meetings, relationships, battles, births, deaths, and other twists of plot and characterization that have taken place within that universe. And by universe, I mean the particular publisher. Readers loved it, and publishers were able to generate brand loyalty, basically. It's a win-win. But, as you might imagine, over 50, 60 years, this gets really complicated. And I'd like to share a little line from Marv Wolfman here. He was one of the biggest comics writers of the 80s, so contemporary of Neil Gaiman. And he says, "The problem began when comics changed, when heroes teamed up with other heroes, when a touch of reality found its way onto the four-color pages. We strove to make our books seem more real by making our characters more realistic. Once you think in that direction, logic shifts somewhat. If Superman can meet Aquaman, there should be consistency between their worlds, because we've just shown that they exist on the same Earth. So that need for consistency meant that if you wanted to use a character in a book, you had to make sure that the look and behavior and personal history of that character matched what was being done in other appearances by that character. And if you wanted a character to be or do something that didn't fit with what was going on in their world at that time, then you better invent some kind of workaround. Like, actually, this isn't regular Wonder Woman, this is Earth 2 Wonder Woman, so it's okay if she does this thing she wouldn't normally do. But then, you had an established Earth 2 Wonder Woman whose continuity also needed to be internally consistent. And the reason I'm going through all this is that by the 1980s, the rules dictated by DC editorial and what readers understood to be true about the characters and the worlds they inhabited had become so complex and arcane that DC decided to wipe the slate completely clean. So they have this major comic event called Crisis on Infinite Earths by Marv Wolfman and George Perez, and they rewrite character history, clean up all the alternate Earths and timelines, and establish an official chronology, an official continuity for the DC universe. So this kind of retroactive continuity was viewed, as Wolfman says, as corrective history, so that if it's not restated, it didn't happen. Marv Wolfman says, starting in January 1986, we only use the past that was good, right? And of course, this never really works long term. Like, DC has rebooted their entire universe at least 3 times since then. But in the 80s, DC had this new, fresh, clean storytelling tapestry that they very much wanted to protect. So if Neil and company want to take the Sandman to hell, then it's going to be that same hell that is in Crisis on Infinite Earths and Alan Moore's Swamp Thing and Hellblazer, the hell that they establish as really and truly existing in the DC universe. And the interesting addition here is that, so you had Swamp Thing had this great darkness storyline, creates chaos and hell, doesn't really follow up with much details. Then in issue 12 of Hellblazer, there's an appearance by the twins, Agony and Ecstasy, who appear in this issue, and there's a reference to hell being ruled as a triumvirate. But you never hear any more about it or see what it actually looks like. So this issue is actually Neil Gaiman kind of yes-anding all of that and actually fleshing out what this infernal triumvirate looks like, which it ends up being the status quo for several years.
So, and I think this is something that you all actually have covered on the other podcast you're on, the MinMax podcast, specifically around Star Wars. That might be something that people in a contemporary setting are a bit more familiar with, that when Disney purchased Star Wars, they went through everything ever created, and they did some creative editing, which maybe, Ashley, you could give us. Kyle's not in the room. He may not listen to this, so it's okay. So just 30 seconds, just what did they do, and then we'll jump into the next thing.
Oh, woof. You're really giving me a lot of credit here to remember the entire history that Kyle brought us up on, because he really is our Star Wars scholar. But from what I understand, the big issue that quote-unquote real Star Wars fans have with regard to the continuity of the canon is that they don't include the books, because those were created prior to a lot of this other lore.
Right.
And they were marketed and they were encouraged and then suddenly just thrown out as far as source material was concerned. So that's why you get a lot of upset people with regard to continuity and Star Wars and such, and like what's referenced and what's not, and what's hinted at kind of playfully, like, oh, we know what you want, wink, but then not giving it to them.
Which is where you might hear it referred to as Star Wars Legends.
Yes.
And that's exactly what it is. It's like, oh, well, that maybe that happened, but it's a legend, which we're also getting right now in the 2 shows right now that are just crushing it, House of the Dragon and the Rings of Power, where they are, they're TV shows, just like what we're doing in our other episodes, right, where we talk about the TV show. Like, they're a different medium. You have to do different things. They do a lot of combining characters to make one full character instead of a bunch of half characters, which when you have 1,000 pages, you can go on and on about all sorts of half characters, but you do need to
there has never been a worse time to be friends with Tolkien scholars right now.
Oh my
because
goodness.
It's my whole feed is just constant complaints right now.
So let's stay in hell. There was a demon, Etrigan, who was the envoy for Dream when he showed up in hell. Who was he? What's his deal? Why is he so cool? Sean?
Why is he so cool indeed? I love Etrigan the Demon. It's just such a great character. Okay, here's what he's about. In the early 70s, Jack Kirby, the king of comics, the guy who created or co-created almost every Marvel superhero you could name, probably the most imaginative and visually exciting artist to ever work in the medium, makes the jump from Marvel over to DC after falling out with Marvel. And it's a big deal, right? But Kirby, magnanimous fellow that he is, refuses to take over writing and drawing a book with a creative team already on it. He doesn't want to take work from anyone. So he takes books where the team is already leaving, like Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, or he creates his own books, like The Demon. And this one intending to capitalize off the revitalization of horror books like House of Mystery, which we've already talked about. And of course, he does it in this amazing Kirby sort of way, just packed to the gills with these awesome ideas. And I actually have an original copy of the first issue around somewhere, the first issue of the Demon as a hand-me-down from my uncle. So the story, the Etragan story, starts in King Arthur's Camelot, which is just awesome. Like, how do you start better than that? Where the wizard Merlin is trying to protect a mystical tome and keep it away from Morgane Le Fay. To do so, he calls up a demon, Etragan, that he forces to do his bidding. But things go sideways, and Merlin traps Etragan in the human form of Jason Blood, ready to be called into service again should the need arise. Now, Jason Blood lives for centuries, passing himself off as his own ancestor and living off his collection of antiquities, and working in the 20th century as a demonologist, which, it's a good thing he has all those antiquities, because I can't imagine that pays much. Of course, Le Fay returns, and Jason Blood is mystically guided to the incantation that will release the demon. Change, change, O form of man. Release the might from fleshy mire. Boil the blood in heart of fire. Gone, gone, the form of man. Rise the demon, Etragan. And I just love this story because there are so many places you could go with it and with the character, along with a really strong supporting cast that Kirby introduced, and just such a cool character design that was actually inspired by a very early comics artist, Hal Forster, his Prince Valiant comic. The look of Etragan, how it looks like he kind of has like duck feet sticking off the side of his head,
Yeah.
That actually, in the Hal Forster comic, those actually are duck feet. Prince Valiant, the character, needs to disguise himself. So he disguises himself as this monstrous figure by skinning a goose, I think, and kind of wrapping it around his face, and it looks like Etragan's face, and that was Kirby's nod to one of his heroes when he created the character. And then, the rhyming, right? Because Dream comments on Etragan rhyming and says, you're coming up in the world, right? So obviously, the incantation that he uses, like, rhymes, and Etragan does a little rhyming in those early issues, but not much. Like, mostly he just talks normally. And then, like often happens, Alan Moore gets a hold of the character, and so he just decides to start having the demon rhyme. And Moore goes further and actually makes it a signal of rank in hell. So Gaiman has kind of keeps going with that and sort of plays on that idea that he didn't always do this, but now he does by saying, you've risen in hell's hierarchy, I see. And that still goes on in DC Comics, like 30 years later. Like, some demons will rhyme, the more important ones, the less important ones won't. It's a cool.
That's incredible.
And so that's who he is. And I suppose he's in this issue in particular just because he happens to be hanging out in hell.
Right place, right time.
Thanks for that, Sean. I had only been familiar with him because of Superman, the animated series. So having all this context, especially for all the rhyming demons, because I definitely didn't understand that at all, was really helpful.
Yeah.
I was thinking of a rhyme, which I did not know. So off to an ad break. Now we must go.
Content warning. In the following section of this podcast, we discuss the topic of self-harm and suicide. If you or someone you know is affected by suicide, struggling, or in crisis, help is available. Call or text the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline on 988 or visit 988lifeline.org in America, 45645 in Canada, and 0800-689-5652 in the UK. Take action for yourself and be there for others. Enjoy the rest of the episode.
All right. Ashley, we obviously have a construction here of hell that may be familiar to those that read Renaissance Italian poetry, and that is of Dante's Inferno, and the construction of hell in some of the different zones, areas that Etragan ends up taking Dream through. And the first place that we start are in the Suicide Woods. And I just thought you could kind of take us on this journey that Dream wanders through, noting that Dante's Inferno is an epic that is thousands of lines long and may be hard for you to summarize.
Yes, thank you. So when we have Dream walking through hell, you've probably not taken a high school English class anytime recently, so the imagery won't come to you all that quickly, but I'm sure Sean is very familiar with the Divine Comedy. No? I thought for sure. I didn't mean to call you out, bro. I'm sorry.
No, I mean, yeah, no, that's okay.
It does seem like you would be really familiar with it.
Well, the thing is, there's a pretty vast amount of like literature and even like Western literature, so you have to like specialize pretty specifically. And medieval Italian poetry was not within my specialty.
It's not for everybody. Especially when you've got what's basically like the very first burn book ever created, because Dante's writing about people he knew or knows that were like in Italian society. So it's honestly, if you know anything of Italian history, it's a very funny thing to read, which you wouldn't expect, despite it being called the Divine Comedy.
The Divine Comedy.
But
a medieval diss record. Yo, like one of the
basic
first
kind of, a little bit, just a little bit, except there's like no retort.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Dante got bars.
He basically goes on to put very specific people from both the church and politics in certain circles of hell, while talking about like how kind and empathetic he is to the people he comes across in hell, which I find hilarious. But the reason that I'm bringing it up here is because we find Dream being led past what are called the Woods of Suicides, and that is an actual place in the Divine Comedy, in the Inferno section in Canto 13. So in Canto 13, we have a wood described to us where those that have forsaken their own lives, and so the suicides, and then those who have forsaken their own goods, so spendthrifts, exist. And that's in the second level of the seventh circle of hell. So suicide victims are condemned to...
And just real quick, on the circles, you want to be further away from one? Is that accurate?
No. One is like...
No.
Where people who couldn't have become Christians because it didn't exist. It was before after their time go. So...
Got it.
2 is like people who don't give up their seat on the bus to like seniors and stuff like that. And then
Okay. Got it.
Well, and it's an interesting thing too, because the further you go in, once you reach the center, Lucifer's there, frozen in ice. And I'm trying to remember what order it goes in, they like climb up him, and then reality shifts and gravity shifts, so then suddenly they're climbing down him. And I can't remember if they climb down and then go up, or if they go up and then climb down, where like it flips because it's meant to be like the center of the earth. Yeah. So it's a whole thing. There, like, geography is involved, Italian philosophy and rhetoric is involved with regard to how, again, the created order is as far as logic. So the way people are punished is based on a lot of sort of rhetorical schemes that were set up in Renaissance Italy, and how we ranked someone's holiness based off of their ability to reason. So how rational they were was indicative of how holy they were. So you've got people who were given to lust and passion. So they're their punishment is to then be buffeted by winds the rest of eternity because they could never consistently stick to one thing. So there are all these really poetic judgments in each circle based off of what sin they commit on Earth. So when you get to the 7th circle, suicide victims are condemned to forfeit their souls to trees with misshapen poisonous branches and black leaves. And then harpies nest in these trees, and while their original bodies can be found tangled in the branches of these trees, they can no longer use their bodies. And the only way that they can speak is if someone injures them by snapping off a branch, which then provokes them to bleed. The idea being that they ended their lives with violence, so now they're dependent on violence to communicate. So it's really dark.
So is that why Dream snaps
Yes.
off that branch? Because I had
Yes.
no idea why that was.
That's exactly why. That's exactly why. Yes.
I was like, why does this happen? Like, there's a little sound effect that says snap and everything, and you see him do that, and it never follows up with anything in this one little corner of one panel.
Yes.
And I had no idea why that. Wow, that's so cool. Thank you.
No, you're good. So they can only speak as long as their blood is flowing. So it's really dark. It's very depressing. So the way that the grove gets planted then in the Inferno is that once a soul is torn from their body, it's sent by Minos to the 7th circle, where it then falls to the ground, sprouts, and grows. Then the harpies eat its leaves and then creates all the pain. And it's said then that the spirits will all be called to the last judgment and will reclaim their mortal bodies that they've forsaken. They will never regain their immortal souls that they took from themselves and will still remain forever trapped in the woods themselves. So when you see Dream, as Sean was mentioning, come to the woods, you see him snap off a branch, which I always thought was really petty. Just like, why is he messing with trees? They don't even have any woods or leaves. Leave them alone.
I was just like, yeah, Neil Gaiman really is like stressing that he's at this point in time, right?
Right. But if you really think about it and you think about what these woods are meant to resemble, and you think about Dream's own relationships with the people that are closest to him, we see this on the next page a little bit, and readers for the first time won't have any context for this character necessarily, but the woman that he encounters that's in the jail cell on the next page, he condemns to hell.
The glass shard lined jail cell.
Yeah. He basically condemns her to hell because she commits suicide after abandoning him in the wake of her grief of her own kingdom, her own tribe. So he's ticked off about that. And he's also got an estranged relationship with his own son, Orpheus, who tried to end his own life after grieving the loss of his wife, Eurydice. So he has a very tense relationship with people who succumb to suicide. So the idea that he is kind of aggressive and aloof with these woods doesn't shock me if you really assess his character. This is something that's stuck in his craw, which I think then understanding both Dream as a character and how the woods of suicides functions within literature, it really helps flesh it out for you. It's so dark, it's so very sad, but that's the context. What is interesting is in the comic book, the trees don't appear to bleed when they speak. They just seem to speak on their own. So that is a little bit of a change. For example, they pass one that is ahead of the one that he snaps the branch off of, that starts describing their suicide without any sort of provocation. You also see when they've zoomed out of the woods, they see the whole wood just saying hurting, 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 and it's a bunch of trees saying that, which is really arresting. And there are no harpies shown living in this grove. So there are some differences. I think the thing that's probably the most arresting in this series of panels is the tree that is speaking, that says, hurting, hurting, I thought the hurting would stop. That's just such a difficult panel to read if you ever struggle with suicidal ideation or if you've ever struggled with depression. That is a really difficult panel, speaking personally, to read as somebody who has both known people who have died by suicide and has wrestled with it myself. So proceed with caution. Frankly, I say this very gently. If this is something you struggle with, this might be one that you want to pace yourself on, because it's a very vivid picture that they've painted here. And it is referencing literature, but man, literature can be a real bore sometimes. And I mean that in like a heavy, hard way, not in a snorefest way.
Thanks, Ashley, for that. It's always a good reminder that while literature has a lot to offer us, it can be very heady and can be very difficult to work through sometimes. All right, so one of the things, Sean, that you had just mentioned during Ashley's talk about Dante's Inferno and the Divine Comedy was that snap. And I can't help but notice that there was a lot of really wonderful penciling work happening here in this particular issue. And I'm just wondering if you could maybe tell us a bit about what the penciler does, because I don't think that's something that we specifically talked about. And who is Sam Keith? And why have you started the Sam Keith Appreciation Club as its very first and founding member?
Yes, we will call the Sam Keith Appreciation Society to order now.
Second.
Motion carries. Okay, so yeah, Sam Keith is the penciler on these first 5 issues, which means he's the one getting the script from the writer, and depending on how, the script is written, he's either closely following those instructions or deciding based on the story how to break down these beats in the script into discrete panels on the page. So he's typically doing the breakdown, the layout of panels on the page, and then creating those initial drawings in pencil. Later on, the inker will come and ink over that and flesh that out and give it sort of depth and shading and things like that. And then, there'll be coloring and lettering later on. But in terms of art, we typically think of the penciler as having, the greatest influence on what you're seeing on the page. And, there's a lot of variety in there. Like, a penciler's work could look completely different based on who the inker is or what the coloring is like. But oftentimes, the penciler is the one who gets the most credit. So I'm going to give Sam Keith a lot of credit here for this absolutely gorgeous issue. There is so much detail and so much imagination and so much weirdness packed into every page. It's really no wonder I read this issue over and over as a kid. And when it comes to like we're not at the finding our favorite panel point yet, but that's going to be tough because you could find a nominee on just about every single page in this book,
Absolutely.
Dream on the Pier, The Gates of Hell, Lucifer's Castle, Lucifer himself, that splash page that are on page 12 and 13 if you have a numbered version. It's the only double page splash in the issue. If you don't have a numbered version, you'll know what I mean. You must know what I mean. The Hellfire Club, Morpheus in his little fedora. It's just such a rich and amazing issue. And so Sam Keith himself. And I want to say that I'm in the last section where I talked about the demon, I was indebted where I talked about the origin of his design to a really great comics journalist named Brian Cronin, who writes for Comic Book Resources. And in this section, talking about Sam Keith, I am indebted to a really great video by the YouTube channel Comic Tropes. Chris, the guy there, did a whole career retrospective thing on Sam Keith. If you're interested in his work from this, I recommend you check it out. It's really great. So Sam Keith, he's a little bit of an odd man out here. He's an American, as opposed to Neil Gaiman and a lot of these hot young comic creators who are coming in right now. He's an American, and he got into the business when he met a writer named William Mesner Loebs at, I think, San Diego Comic-Con. So they became friends, and Sam Keith was later invited to do backup art on a creator-owned series that Mesner Loebs had. So based on that, in 1983, Mesner Loebs recommends Keith as an illustrator for some work from the Comico publishing company, including as an inker on Matt Wagner's Mage series. Matt Wagner, also just awesome comics creator, writer, and artist. And as a quick side note, Wagner's long-running series Grendel is also being adapted by Netflix right now. Grendel is absolutely, I think, ultimately as impressive as Sandman, but it's very, very different. Like Sandman comes off as being like this total and complete, vision of a work. Like it feels like Neil Gaiman knew exactly where this is ending from the second you open the first page, pretty much. Whereas Grendel develops very slowly over the course of years, and you can it's very cool to see that kind of work develop. But that's a little side note there. So Matt Wagner already in the 80s. Gaining a lot of acclaim, and so Sam Keith inking his work is pretty impressive. It gets some attention, and he starts getting a bit more work. Now, Sam Keith's distinctive style and artistic interests, they haven't really developed at this point where he's working on Sandman. Like, he's very early in his career here, and it's been pretty tough for him to break in the business overall. So, like, at one point, he gets a chance to ink another DC book. I think this is in like maybe mid-80s somewhere. He gets a chance to ink a DC book written by a legendary comic book writer, Roy Thomas. Roy Thomas hates his inks and actually says to him, according to Sam Keith, "Kid, you're bad. You'll never work in comics again.
No.
Quit while you're behind."
Wow.
Yeah. So this is like the guy... This is the guy who took over the Avengers from Stan Lee. Like, this guy's big in the comics world and has been for decades. And this guy just tells Sam Keith, "You're crap." Now, luckily, he was very, very wrong, and Sam Keith didn't listen to him. In fact, he says, looking back on it, the success he's had is built on all these little failures. He says, "Everything I've done is built on all these bad anatomied bodies I've drawn and all these bad stories I've tried to write. I mean, you stick around 15 to 20 years and you get an awful lot of failures that you can climb on top of," which I thought was a nice way to look at it. By 1987, he gets a job illustrating a series called, you ready for this? Adolescent Radioactive Black Belt Hamsters.
Oh my goodness.
It was the 80s,
Is that just a total ripoff of Teenage Mutant Ninja
That's
Turtles?
what I was thinking.
Yes. Which was itself intended as a ripoff of Frank Miller's work on Daredevil. So we're really getting far from the source here.
Oh my gosh.
Derivation of derivations of derivations. Yeah.
But hey, it was on this book that Sam met a fella named Mike Dringenberg, who he would later invite to work with him on Sandman. So if it weren't for this Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles ripoff, we might have never gotten Dringenberg on Sandman. We might have never gotten his sort of sexier version of Morpheus. And most importantly, we might never have gotten that iconic design of Death. All because of adolescent radioactive black belt hamsters.
Wow.
So
Amazing. Sam.
yeah. So then in 1988, Karen Berger gets wind of Keith's indie work and recommends him to Neil for Sandman, which actually ends up being a bit ironic because Berger and Keith do not get along one bit, apparently. Now, I would put Karen Berger on like my Mount Rushmore of comics. I absolutely adore her and think the work she's done is just like staggering in its importance to the medium. But according to Sam Keith, he says, "At the time, all I could do was think of how I wanted to be drawing any other book but that one. Because I didn't like my art on it, and I was fighting with the editor really hard. She would say, 'I'm thinking of whether to fire you today.'
Oh my gosh.
I would think, yes, yes, yes." Like, that's a messed up work environment there.
That's horrible.
He actually even wanted to paint the panels and then go back in and do the line art. But according to him, Karen Berger said, no, that would be too expensive. And so he saw Dave McKean doing these mixed media, really cool covers. And he's like, okay, well, it's too expensive for me, I guess. So there was some, it wasn't a great collaboration. I think the nicest thing Sam Keith said about it, about himself and about this arrangement, was that he felt like Jimi Hendrix playing in the Beatles. Not that there was anything wrong with them really, but it was just an arrangement that didn't work. But looking at how stunning this issue is, it's hard to believe the collaboration wasn't working out. I do sort of think you can see it a little bit in the previous issue, in the Dream of Me one. Maybe just misalignment, lack of enthusiasm on Sam Keith's part. I don't know. But with this issue, Neil was trying to play to Sam's strengths. He set this issue in hell for him to draw those really cool, sort of exaggerated figures that Keith can do. Ultimately, it wasn't enough, though, and Sam Keith left after one more issue. Now, in subsequent work, his style would develop in really interesting ways. Like, Keith loves those exaggerated, cartoonish forms that still manage to keep this sense of depth and gravity to them. His superhero figures are these hunched, hulking, and hairy sort of brutes, making him a great fit for characters like Wolverine and the Hulk, etc. But his most memorable work is probably The Max, which he produced as a creator-owned series for Image Comics. He was actually, invited in as the first wave of comic book creators who were offered an Image book after that initial group who formed the company, who founded the company. In that very next wave, Sam Keith was invited in to do and own the book that he created, and what he created was The Max. It was later turned into a brilliant and groundbreaking animated series on MTV. If you can find it, I would encourage you to watch it. It's just like, if you like animation, it's very cool, and it's very different than anything that was being done at that time. The Max, on one level, it's the story of a big, hairy, homeless guy who thinks he's a superhero in a dream world called the Outback that's ruled by a jungle queen and threatened by the villainous Mr. Gone. But it's really the story of Julie Winters, a social worker trying to overcome the trauma of a violent assault in her past. It's a series that was ahead of its time in its treatment of trauma and recovery, of mental illness, and in its deconstruction of the toxic hypermasculinity in superhero comics of the day. It's a great comic and an even better cartoon. Check it out if you can. And that's Sam Keith.
So if you want to come join the Sam Keith Appreciation Club, you can hit up Sean on Twitter directly, or even better, hop into our Discord and come and chat all day about Sam Keith. As the last topic for today, we're going to go back over to Ashley, and we're going to talk about Eschatalogical Oblivion and Nothingness in the oldest game. This is what Dream and the Demon, the Corazon, were playing at the end of the issue to get his mask back.
Okay, yes, I promise I'll make nothing fun for you guys. But just to review real quick, because I've brought it up in the past, eschatology and the idea of the eschatos is a Greek term, which means last things. So eschatology is the study of last things, judgment, death, etc. And obviously we're in hell, and they're playing this game, the oldest game, that has to do with the imagination and trying to outsmart or best your opponent by having their imagination run out, ultimately. So it's pertinent to the story of this specific issue. And Oblivion obviously being the destruction of all things, and that's kind of how the oldest game starts to end until Dream pulls something out that really is very arresting to the entire room. I find this conversation really hilarious because, for context on myself and my own life, the last dissertation I wrote was specifically about nothingness, found in a different set of works. So I really do feel like this is a weird time for my own academic knowledge to be coming to play. I could have never prepared for this better, nor could I have anticipated this moment. So I'm very excited. So to understand where I'm coming from when I'm reading this issue again, looking at this oldest game and seeing how Dream pulls a win from thin air, is I am thinking about two very specific terms, eukontic nothingness and meontic nothingness. And these are Greek philosophical terms. Eukontic nothingness being the kind of nothingness that you would typically think of, like pure lack, absolute nothing, negative nothing. Gertrude Stein once said, there's no there. So that's what you're trying to not think of when you're thinking of eukantic nothingness. It's the absolute lack of anything. There's no potential. It's void. Meontic nothingness is like a blank piece of paper. There's potential there. It's nothingness you can do something with. So if you look at a blank piece of paper, what's on it? Nothing. But there could be something. That's meontic nothingness. So when they're playing the oldest game, Karamzin attempts to win by trying to describe ultimate oblivion, what he would imagine would be success in this case. In his scope as a demon living in hell, what a win would look like would be ultimate oblivion, the absolute lack of anything, thus introducing this idea of eukantic nothingness, absolute void. And he thinks he succeeded. He's very confident in this answer. He feels like he's successfully led Dream into this dead end. But then you have Dream take that idea and that confidence and completely turn it on its head, reimagining this eukantic nothingness into a meontic nothingness, this potential-filled space, this blank space where hope thrives. And I find that really fascinating, especially after our encounter with the Wood of Suicides, because you still kind of see Dream being this very sort of cynical, depressed, very lonely figure. And yet I feel like he realizes something as a character that even in this depressed space where he's surrounded by enemies, that he really actually does have a purpose and that his domain has power even in hell. And that's fascinating to me, reading this as a theologian, because you're taking the place that's supposed to squelch all hope, and create terror and reintroduce chaos and create torturous scenes for people, whether deserved or undeserved. We've seen a lot of undeserved torture in this issue. And to introduce hope in this space first, to take this character who is depressed and lonely, place them in the worst place possible, and that's when he realizes the power of his own domain and what dreams can offer even the tortured and the hellbound is incredible. And I just love that that's where that takes place, that he can take something like absolute negative nothing and that's the inspiration for hope, and that's where that's born, and that's ultimately what wins the game. So to be able to push that to the brink and create this really beautiful scene that even we'll get to panels, but there's a panel where even Lucifer starts to take notice when Dream has changed his tactic, almost like he's realized what's about to happen. I just love how that develops panel after panel. It's really, really well done. And I think it also helps bring readers, whether they're familiar with Christian theology or they're not, into this conversation with theodicy. Theodicies are explanations as to how divine goodness can cohabitate with the existence of evil. So, for example, how does a good God let bad things happen? I feel like that sort of tiptoes on the edge of that question in a really beautiful way without getting preachy, because we all require hope to exist and to persevere, just like Sam Keith. Astounding to me his perseverance in the face of being told that he's terrible. That is something I aspire to, that level of tenacity. And
yeah, really.
You know, and so to see imagination play out in that way in this fictional scene, again, is something that I just read over and over and over again, and I'm so inspired by. I mean, this is the first comic book that has ever managed to make me cry. I remember the first time I read it, I was just sitting there sobbing because of this issue and because of this scene, the fact that he's able to pull something so very clever and frankly very kind, I think, in a world that's supposed to be a horror comic. I think is just absolutely brilliant. So I geek out about this issue in particular just because of its composition and its ultimate result. And even Despite this lesson, Lucifer still attempts to snare Dream, only to realize that he has actually created this space for hopes and dreams to thrive. So despite being thrown out of heaven for the audacity of wanting to rule more and have ultimate power, and then tries to create his own realm in some regard, he's really not created anything new because he's still allowing ultimate hope to survive even in his own space. And he can't, the most important part is that he can't control that. And so he's once again thwarted by another existing authority figure in his life that he can't overcome.
Well, and it's the way that Dream, as we've seen him for the last, 4 issues working towards this spot, and to think that the thing that is going to get him through the situation that he is in is a reflection back of himself onto this domain in terms of hope is really powerful and a really amazing place for him as a character to be able to pull that from, because we don't really kind of see this in the comic or have any real good idea of how much time, which I'm going to put in quotes because this is all, it's all a bit different in how they experience time. But very close together, I think, is a reasonable assumption to make from he was probably in his mind in that glass cage, moments ago is how it would feel.
We know like 3 days went by in the Constantine issue.
Right.
We know there's 3 days. I think that's it.
I think
that's
so.
the only time
He gets the sand, goes home, goes to hell.
Yeah.
Maybe the journey to hell takes across the plains of damnation take a half a day to walk. I mean, it doesn't seem like it takes too long of a time,
Right.
Because they only show us a few scenes, and so he was just trapped in this glass jail for 100 years and had a lot of self-doubt and a lot of other things going on, and just how he chooses to win here, because I don't think there was ever a doubt that he was not going to be able to win. But the path he decided to go was admirable.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, yeah, I think you guys have said it all. But this was the highest selling issue of the comic up until the first appearance of Death, and I think it's because it's so perfectly constructed. You have those initial mentions of hope that start the issue. It happens a few times, like when Dream is on the pier, when he's coming down in front of the gates of hell, and then when he runs into Nada, it's mentioned again. I hoped one day you would come to me, free me, my love, please. Right, and that introduces another sort of bittersweet layer there too. He's intimately acquainted with the importance of hope under conditions of despair, both as the being experiencing that and as the being causing that, right? And the game itself, I have not really encountered anywhere where Gaiman talks about constructing the rules for that game, whether that came from some sort of 60s fantasy novel he read or something like that, or if there's something in comic history to draw from. But it seems so perfect that these metaphysical beings would do combat in the realm of metaphor and imagery, right? Like, it's just so perfect.
Yeah, I tried
Absolutely.
looking for some sort of history on the oldest game, and I couldn't find anything, but that doesn't mean that I did an exhaustive search. I just really tried to find any little snare to go through, and no threads.
All right, so hear me out. Producer Pat here. So we have the first diss album, right? The medieval diss album. And now we have people on stage trading metaphors to try to corner each other. This sounds a lot like a rap battle taking place in hell, right? Am I wrong?
Yeah, I mean,
Am I wrong?
Totally.
That makes me really anxious, though, because if that's what happens in the TV show, I quit.
Oh my God, they wouldn't do that with it. No, Teen Witch.
We'll find
some
out.
terrible
like Tom
80s.
Sturz pulls his hoodie up. It's like
Knees weak, palms are sweaty. No.
getting all mom spaghetti about it.
No, that's totally unacceptable. They won't do it, will they?
Oh, wow. Ashley, thank you so much for bringing me down here to the Hellfire Club with you. This has been a really amazing evening.
Thank you. Yes. No, I've met all of my best friends here. We come here every weekend, usually around 6 o'clock.
Yeah, the stakes here seem pretty tense for a normal night. I really wonder kind of what's going to happen. It seems like the universe might end based on how this goes. Wow, what a discussion. Thank you so much, Ashley and Sean, for that true deep dive into this particular issue. But we need to jump in. We need to give the fans what they want, which are your favorite panels and favorite non-Morpheus characters. So, Sean, let's start with you. What's your favorite panel this week?
Oh gosh, this is such a hard one.
One might say it's torture.
You can't say the whole issue.
Yes. As much as I want to do that splash page, it's just do yourself a favor and take some time and look at it.
Are you smuggling in a bonus panel when I said to go quick?
I know. I think I am. Look at that splash page. Look at all the monsters and creatures and weird forms that are in there. You could do it all day. Okay.
A classic smuggle.
Yes.
A classic Joanna Robinson smuggle.
Let me go for my one. So when we first started talking about this series, I was talking about the way I initially encountered it, which was in a Wizard magazine special edition in 1994, right? And I remember very clearly that panel of the reveal of Lucifer, like the David Bowie Lucifer.
Yes.
This is totally David Bowie, right?
Yeah.
But the reveal of the David Bowie Lucifer being in there and it just like lighting off fireworks, like oh, that's such a cool idea. Because as a kid, I was just only familiar with that like red-faced, like big
Old
diabolical being. Yeah.
Thorns.
So
Old Scratch.
right. So this
So many names for Satan.
So this angelic figure with the reptilian wings was just such a revelation to me, no pun intended, and one that I thought was really cool and just such a great reveal of how this story was going to do things differently. So that's my panel, sentimental favorite.
Amazing. And you smuggled in the other one.
And
Ashley, over to you. What's your favorite panel this
So
week?
I almost picked that same panel because it looked like a Pantene Pro V commercial, just like incredible sort of hair. And I envied that hair and I envied that jumpsuit. But I'm going to go to a different.
That's the curly girl method. You just gotta just sign up for it.
I'm actually going to jump to a different Lucifer panel. It's one I briefly mentioned during the oldest game when it's after Dream says that he is the world, space floating, life nurturing, and then you just have one panel of Lucifer looking up from his drink, and the tension that creates within that scene, you almost feel the room's energy shift just from that one panel. So just the intensity of his stare, exactly the effect Dream's response had on the room. And Lucifer, I feel like, is realizing Dream is actually much stronger and much more clever than he really bargained for. And so I just love that one look could communicate all of that. And just, it sends chills down my spine every time.
So we'll do this snake draft style. So Mowers, you're up for your favorite non-Morpheus character.
Okay, so normally I pick something serious, but this time, looking at that splash page, I'm going with something a little goofy. If you look towards the center, kind of to the left of the Shape of Water looking merman, there's a little blue worm guy being choked out by an octopus.
Oh yeah,
in a red cap
with his little newsboy cap and
right.
sort of thing.
So the little worm in the red baseball cap or newsboy's cap being clutched by an octopus. I love him and I want to save him because he looks a little out of context. He looks like if Richard Scarry's lowly worm had a younger brother. And that's all I could think when I was looking at him. Just like, I don't understand why he's in hell. He looks too innocent to be in hell. What could he have possibly done to be there in the first place? He doesn't look particularly threatening, so I don't think he's a demon, but he might be. Who knows? Who's to say? Maybe I'm underestimating him, but I'm just drawn to him every time.
So is this going to be your new plushie, part of your new plushie
I think it might be part of my plushie collection.
All right, Sean, take us home.
All right,
favorite non-Morpheus character.
As much as I love the demon, and especially how he's portrayed here, he's like sort of amoral, like walking takes Dream to Lucifer, does what he's supposed to do, but sticks the knife in a little bit when he walks him by. Nada, right? Like,
Are you smuggling in
I'm just
another
smuggling in another one.
choice?
I definitely
It's a
am.
Sean smuggle. What are you doing?
But I am going to make my choice Karanzan. Out of pity, because this guy had no idea what he was getting into. Like, he was so overmatched and so, like, confident, like, dressed up in, like, his fishnets and his torn, like, shorts and all that, just, like, taking everybody to the club. Like, this has this whole vibe. He's thinking, I'm gonna run this, I'm gonna be a boss, and he just blows it completely. And I just love his face when he realizes he lost. Like, that there's that three panel row across the top where he's trying to think of an answer to I Am Hope, when he just is like, I don't know, and he just like looks down, so brokenhearted, so out of pity, poor Karanzan, I'm gonna give it to him.
Excellent. Well, thank you both so much for a riveting discussion. Ashley, you lent us your expertise with a well-studied background of Satan, the Satan, as well as hell, especially the version that we get in Dante's Inferno. Sean, you filled us in on DC Comics universe, continuity, why it's important, and how Neil Gaiman basically had a clean, fresh new start to work with within DC, specifically when it came to the triumvirate ruling hell. I think we can all agree he uses this canvas masterfully. Thanks for all the info on penciling as well. Shout out to Sam Keith. Hop into our Discord to join that fan club. A common thread I noticed in both of your deep dives is a long literary tradition of rewrites, derivations, and reinterpretations. I'm really looking forward to next week when we discuss Netflix's reinterpretation of this issue for the big screen.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Sandman Unlocked.
And remember, never trust the storyteller, only trust the story.
Thanks for tuning in to The Sandman Unlocked, an Odd Conduit Media production. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Sandman Unlocked. Join us on Discord as well. Thanks to our show producer, Patrick Childers, and to Lieutenant Headtrip for our theme and incidental music. If you'd like to support us directly, head over to our Patreon. You can follow Ashley on Twitter at DEEDEE_K and on Instagram and TikTok at Ashley Mowers. Find Sean on Twitter at Lon Dogson and find Headtrip everywhere at LT Headtrip. You can get all of this info and more in the show notes. Make sure to follow and subscribe and review us wherever you listen. Until next time, and remember, never trust the storyteller, only trust the story.
Thanks again for listening. On this episode, we discussed the topic of self-harm and suicide. Now, if you or someone you know is affected by suicide, struggling, or in crisis, help is available. Call or text the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline on 988 or visit 988lifeline.org. In Canada, you can dial 45645, and in the UK, 0800 689 5652. Take action for yourself and be there for others.